So I'm very pleased to welcome you to this fourth board meeting of 2022. And I, of course, I hope that you are all keeping very well and safe. So I'd like also to welcome our official observers, Chego Madis. I can't see her, but I hope that Chego is with us. Garia from PIOB Observer. Gaili Hansen, our IESBA CAG chair, and Junpei Kato from the Japan FSA. Welcome to the official observers and thank you for being with us. And also welcome to all those observers who have registered to be with us today. Welcome to all of you and thank you for joining us and for being interested in our discussion. I'd also note that the upcoming new board members, Hania Mardini and Paul Mutara, they have registered to observe this meeting. They told that they were not sure that they could make it because of previous commitments, but at least they showed a lot of interest in our discussion and were checking the documents and etc. So it's a very good opportunity for them to start onboarding and becoming familiar with the discussions. So a warm welcome to all of you who have, well, I think all the board members with us, that nobody is missing. And so this is a very good opportunity for us to reconvene and discuss again our sustainability project. And before I give the floor to Mark Babington, and I don't know if anyone else from the working group or from the staff to present on the progress made since September, of course, the first thing that I have to say, and I owe to the working group, is to praise and thank them for the amazing work done since September and the progress made and everything that they were able to produce. So that today we have these samples, these documents in front of us and can discuss a little bit more in concrete the future of this project. But before I give the floor to Mark, just allow me in 1 minute to frame the discussion that we will hold here today and the reasons why we are here today. As you will recall, in September, the board agreed to hold a meeting in November to consider the work that would be done by the working group according to its suggested approach and see how that work or the product of that work developed along the lines discussed in September would look like. This is a very new area for all of us. It's the first time that we are discussing these topics, and so the decision that was made was that somewhere in November, on the 1st of November, we would come back together and see how the work looked like, to see which considerations it may bring and which direction and guidance the board would like to give to the working group. And this is because not everybody was 100% clear about the exact sense of direction in September. And at the same time, we recognize and acknowledge that there was some fresh, very new information coming to the board, being conveyed to the board at the same time that we were discussing and that we were making decisions, etc., about the possible pathways. And I naming just one of the informations that just popped up in the middle of our discussions on the same day or the day after, I don't remember anymore, like is the IESBA statement and some further considerations triggered by the call for profession agnostic standards that was made clear in that statement from IESBA. So in those circumstances, in that context, the board was also in support of the working group developing some work in accordance with its suggested direction, so that the board could assess in November how it looked like and whether that, let's call it sample, developed according to the proposed direction of the working group, how that looked like, and if it is something that is or would lead us to a satisfactory output. No definitive decision was made about the final package, even if we are to decide how to progress in this work. Of course, it is my conviction, and I think it's our conviction, considering the characteristics of this project, that we will have to remain agile and very nimble, because what we don't know yet, and it's a lot, may force us to change or to adjust direction along the way. So this is also a little bit learning by doing. There is a lot that we know already, and that allows us to progress. But we have to acknowledge that there is also a lot that we don't know, and that as we go, we will have to assess and address new information, new facts, some changes that will for sure happen along the way, and also some risks that we will identify along the way, and that we may not be aware of today. So, what is expected from the board, and that's what where I wanted to land. What is expected from the board today is a very careful reflection on the work that has already been developed by the working group. Thanks again to the working group, and a very careful assessment of the final, or the expected final output against the facts and against the risks that we are able to identify today at this stage, and against what we consider to be a successful result and output of this work. This is what the board is being called, is to look at the work that has been done, to the considerations that it triggers, what success looks like, and confront this work in this direction with this vision. But I'll stop here and immediately give the floor to Mark, thanking him again for the impressive work done in these 2 months, less than 2 months, and ask please Mark to present on this work and the documents that have been submitted in support to this meeting. Mark, please.
Thank you, Gabriella. I hope everyone can hear me. Before we start sharing the slides, can I just also add my own sort of little bit of context to really support what Gabriella's said, and that is our board has two functions. It is both a strategic board and it is a technical board. And we are responsible for taking both strategic and technical decisions. The difficulty is that the strategic decision and the technical decision don't necessarily get taken at the same time. And one of the challenges that we're finding, and Gabriella has mentioned this in previous discussions with the board, is that this is a very fast-moving environment. So there is a lot we still have to learn that will inform the board's strategic decisions about ultimately how IESBA will address the challenge that has been set for us by IOSCO, the FSB, the global regulatory community. However, we also need to make progress on the technical work, and therefore what I'm going to do today, with the support of our excellent staff and with my colleagues on the working group, is I'm going to ask you as a board for your reflections and for your permission to make progress on the technical work that needs to be done if we are going to be ready next year to make difficult strategic decisions on the basis of information we still need to collect. And I'll give you some examples of what I mean. It's absolutely vital for IESBA that our work is broadly endorsed and broadly adopted, but it needs to be broadly endorsed and broadly adopted in a developing landscape. We saw the letter that was circulated from our colleagues in Australia and New Zealand, where they shared with us their insight of how sustainability reporting and assurance is developing in those jurisdictions. We're aware of the Securities and Exchange Commission's consultation on changes to its rules. And we're also aware that the situation in Europe continues to develop. So the CSRD proposals that we believe will go to Parliament later this month are ever closer aligning the EU Audit Directive and Regulation with sustainability. So even to the extent that the proposal is a statutory auditor will now, where applicable, apply to assurance engagements of sustainability reporting. So if we're going to deliver the best possible product, we need to collect more information to inform our strategic decision. And I realise that that's a slightly unusual situation for a working group to be coming to the board with, where we're saying some of the big decisions that we have to take will have to be taken at some point in the future between now and when we finalise an exposure draft to go out to consultation later next year. So I just think that that's a really important piece of context. And I hope that that is something that the board will bear in mind as we consider the proposals of the working group. What we're asking for is your agreement to proceed with technical work that will support those strategic considerations and decisions to be taken later on. So if you can, Astu, could you put the slides back up now, please? Thank you. So I've sort of set that basic context, and what the working group has been doing is it's been focusing in particular on the technical challenge that we face and how we deliver on that. And what I'm going to present to you today are a number of options that are set out in the covering paper and in the supporting papers to show you the different routes to market that we have to address the challenge of developing new independence standards and new ethical standards to support this work. If we can go to the next slide, please. What we're looking at is to say, can we agree an overall approach for developing that material, but we don't necessarily have to agree at this stage the vehicle that sits in, and also to consider other matters relevant to the challenge that the board set the working group at its September meeting. So how do we go about revising the parts 1 to 3 of the code, what the resources and timeline are for the development of this work, and also the development potentially of a standalone handbook to help with the interpretation of this material. If we can go to the next slide, please, Astu. The key developments since the September meeting, which have informed our thinking to date. So further targeted outreach with a number of key stakeholders, including IOSCO, the GRI, the ICGN, the PAIB Advisory Group, and XRB. There was the PIOB Public Interest Workshop, the FSB Progress Report and Roadmap, outreach that was carried out by Ken and Gabriella and others in Brussels and Paris, and also the publication of our staff document on greenwashing. So we have been in a fairly swift moving environment. If we can move to the next slide, please. Our current thinking is set out on this slide. Sustainability information is obviously important. It's of heightened public interest. It's being used for capital allocation decisions. So therefore, sustainability assurance practitioners should use the same high ethics and independence standards as an auditor would when reporting using a general purpose reporting framework. And those same ethics and independence standards should apply regardless of who does the work. And that's certainly what we're seeing in the European Union's proposals for CSRD. However, in recognition of the fact that there are a broader range of practitioners working in this space than just professional accountants, we need to develop standards that are ultimately applicable by a wider group of providers. So therefore, one of the key things for the working group and ultimately for any task force or task forces is to engage with that non-PA community to better understand the ethics and independence that inform independent standards that informs the work that they currently carry out. We still want to leverage the existing code, but identify and address gaps that we face. And we need to think how to best package and draft those revisions to meet the objectives that IESBA and others have set for us. I think probably it's fair to say that we hadn't necessarily appreciated the scale of future stakeholder engagement that will need to be carried out to inform this work. And I'm pleased to tell the board that already we've had an offer from a significant stakeholder to help us in Q1 of next year to run some global roundtables to reach out not just to PAs, but to the non-PA community to inform the development of the work that we do. And of course, we're working to a very fast timescale. If we can move to the next slide, please, Astu. Here is an overview of the workstream activities, obviously focusing on the three areas that the board set for us. So independence, and that includes revisions to the independent standards, potentially guidance for the non-PA community on how to apply the code to sustainability and assurance engagements, the wider challenge of putting material within, in particular, parts 2 and 3 of the code to help with addressing gaps in the ethics provisions, but also to provide more context and more examples. And then also the board did also flag the need to understand the use of experts in sustainability reporting and assurance and consider whether or not there is a wider project to take forward with the IESBA when they revise ISO 620. So a very significant amount of work to be taken forward. And it's fair to say that the bulk of the papers that you have today are focusing on that first block, the independence standards, because we wanted to show you some of the options that are available to deliver revised independent standards. If we can go on to the next slide, please. And I should say, of course, in looking at this, we've been working very closely with the IESBA. They're also working to a very advanced timetable, looking to issue exposure drafts in Q3 of next year. And of course, we want to be able to demonstrate we can move in lockstep. But this next slide shows you the 4 potential options that we've considered in developing revisions to the extant code. So taking the discussion that we had in September, those focus on how we could develop part 4A of the code. And the first 3 options, effectively, you've got text that's shown based on, I think, sections 400 and 405, which show in option 1, how to use sustainability assurance engagements without amending the definition of audit as used in part 4A. But of course, there may be more information that comes out with regards to that. Option 2, based on the current extant model, the term audit is extended to include sustainability assurance engagements as well as review engagements. And option 3, which uses more general neutral terms, practitioner and engagement. In option 3, of course, we've not yet reflected the ETGA revisions, and we will, of course, need to adapt and revise any new definitions that arise from the ETGA work if the option that the board decides to go ahead with ultimately follows any of these routes. And the thing that we should understand with options 1, 2 and 3 is that they retain the provisions that apply to audit and review engagements. There will be the adaptation of definitions and concepts. We'll add sustainability specific examples and guidance, and we'll ensure we align with the ISSA 5000 that the IESBA is proposing. There is a question as the code develops to support a wider group of practitioners, not just professional accountants, about whether or not the code should change its title. I think that's another of those decisions not to be taken in this call or necessarily in approving a project plan in November, but it's one thing that we need to fold into this strategic discussion. Option 4 that you have proposes establishing a separate Part 4A. So it revises Part 4A to address independence requirements for sustainability assurance engagements. It would be positioned before Part 4B, and it would be similar to option 1, but without the references to audit. So it would delete provisions that apply to audit and review engagements. It would put in appropriate definitions for sustainability assurance, add the specific examples, and again align to where the IESBA is going with its own standard development. If we can go to the next slide, please. The planning committee has discussed the proposals, and I think the most important thing, and it links to my comment about strategic decisions that maybe need to be taken in future. The planning committee recognised the importance of IESBA needing to be able to pivot and respond to the way in which this landscape continues to develop. So it recognised that option 4 provides a starting point for drafting a separate professional agnostic independence provisions and revising the ethics standards. And we need to consider the relevance of the entire code in that context, and also what guidance might be developed alongside the revised code. The planning committee also raised concerns about changes to the code which might conflict with the finalisation of the ETGA definitions, and therefore we needed to be careful about how we dealt with that, particularly recognising that stakeholders raised concern about the scale of change in the code, and therefore we need to try and make sure our work is manageable. And the planning committee also set out that there was a pathway for adopting the code by non-PAs that's not yet been identified, and that we need to begin to understand what actions will be taken at a jurisdictional level by regulators and by national standard setters. So therefore, how is it going to be that we can deliver what our stakeholders want in the most accessible and helpful way? And obviously that there's a challenge there, that we need something that slots in and meets those needs, but doesn't create a significant additional jurisdictional burden for legislation. So these are things that we need to understand and need to carry out additional outreach to be able to better understand and respond to this question. If we can go on to the next slide, please. What that does is it shows you effectively two options. The working group recommended an approach based on the indicative direction that we took in September, where we would have revisions in the context of Part 4A or a new Part 4A of the code, and that there would be wider revisions in particular to Parts 2 and 3. Some members of the planning committee have again put forward the option of an entirely separate handbook. But as I said, regardless of where we ultimately land, we need to develop the material that will fit into either of these options. And therefore, that's why we're asking the board for cover to develop the project plan. And I realise this is a slightly unorthodox sort of exercise that we're going through, but it does recognise the fact that it is an extremely fast-moving situation that we're in. So if I can just set out the matters for consideration on the next slide, please, Astu. What we're asking really is for the board's reflection and consideration of how do we best address these needs. Are you comfortable with the proposal that what we do is proceed with developing the technical material and that we wait to take the strategic decisions until we are better informed and we've been able to carry out more stakeholder outreach, particularly in those areas where our understanding is still developing and is not complete? We're also really interested to hear the board members' thoughts about the options that are put forward in agenda items A1 to A4. So options 1, 2, 3 and 4, what you think of those, whether there are wider issues that we need to consider. and then also the initial thinking about the project plan and the project timeline to provide further input to us as a working group, so we can develop that for the board. And if I can just take another 30 seconds, what you'll see in the next 3 slides is we've tried to set out a project plan and timeline. This is for information only at this stage because it requires further work once we've had your direction and your input. But it would be really good to get board members' thoughts and advice. Now, if I can pause there before I hand back, can I ask if any of my working group colleagues, so if any other members of the working group, so Jens, Laurie, Christelle or Vanya, and indeed whether any of our staff, so Diane, Keith and Sylvia, want to add anything that I've omitted to say. And I think we can lose the slides now, Astu, and go back onto the normal screen, if that's all right. Vanya.
I'd like to endorse everything that you said so far, Mark. I think we discussed more or less these positions on the September meeting, and I still believe that to create a separate portion of the code will make the current code weaker, and I think that it would not be the best solution, but we understand that we are here to discuss and to balance what's new and if it is relevant enough to change the recommendation from the working group so far.
Thank you, Vanya. Christelle?
Yes, thank you. I support everything you said, and I'm convinced that we need that flexibility, which is a challenge. But we need that flexibility to be able to have these some strategic decisions further on the way. And there is one very important thing I'm deeply convinced of, is that we need very strong input, very deep input from what is called non-PA interested parties. I think we need, of course, at the end, their support to embark on what would be done, but we also need to understand how they see their ethical challenge right now. And it's going to be very interesting input.
Thank you, Christelle. Laurie?
Yeah, just very briefly, Mark, I think you laid this out really well. I think I would just, for all the board members, this is a very complex area, and it's also novel for our board moving into sort of uncharted waters. And I think this flexibility point is going to be important. And you mentioned it, Gabriella mentioned something similar when she was speaking. I think it's going to draw on all of us as board members to think, I hate this, think outside the box, whatever euphemism you want to use for that, as we work through this problem, because I think it's extremely complex. So well said.
Thank you, Laurie. And I think the analogy that we have is that, you know, we are moving into this strategic stroke political space, and it's not necessarily an ideology that wins. It's going to be the broadest consensus and adoption of our standards that drives it. Jens? You're on mute, Jens.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry. I think it's a little bit like a dilemma. On the one side, we have different stakeholders. On the one side, we want to accommodate the professional accountants to have an easy access to the new rules, the new standards, in a context which is easy to understand. At the same time, we have these other stakeholders, the non-PAs, and we have to learn how to accommodate them and how we can balance these two interests. And I think you put it very well to say, and Gabriela mentioned it at the beginning too, that's why we have to stay agile to find the best way to fulfill both expectations. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jens. And I think, you know, as a working group, we're very comfortable with the journey that we've been on, but ultimately the test for us is how do we ensure that our code is used by the widest possible group, and that it drives high quality independence and it drives high quality ethical behaviour in this important work stream, because the biggest public interest consideration is that, and we've got to make sure that we are able to land it in a way that deals with that. I think, Gabriela, that's probably everything I wanted to say, and hopefully we can use the rest of the time to allow board members to ask questions and also to give their reflections on what they've heard, really to see if they're comfortable with the proposal that we continue to work on the technical development, and that we continue to gather information and insight that will help us make those strategic decisions later on in the project plan.
Sure, Mark. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation, and that there is a lot of insightful information and thought sharing that I very much thank you. Well, but I see that before I say something that Ken wants to say something, I'd like also to add something, but Ken, please.
So unmute button. Yeah, thank you very much, Gabriela. Yeah, I thought before we sort of open the floor to all board members to kind of weigh in on the working group's presentation. And Mark, thank you for this excellent sort of outline of the working group's thinking and the journey you've traveled since our September board meeting. I thought before we sort of open the floor for discussion, I'd share some reflections more from a technical analysis perspective in terms of how I'm seeing the options that are presented, and perhaps highlight some potential challenges, practical challenges, if we were to go down that pathway. Now, that's not to say that that would not be the appropriate road to travel, because I entirely subscribe to your and Gabriela's message, Mark, that in a way this is early days, and we have been having our discussions in a closed room, so to speak, and we really need to be out there talking to our stakeholders, and in particular to that part of the stakeholder community that comprise the non-PAs, who would be in many sense, in many respects, stepping into the space of sustainability assurance. So just perhaps if you bear with me, and I'll try to be as concise as possible, but I thought I'd outline some reflections as to how I perhaps see some of the, as I see some of the potential practical challenges relative to the options presented. First of all, I think we probably would all agree that when it comes to integrated assurance engagements, in other words, where a firm of professionals or a firm of assurance providers, whether they, well, in this case, it ought to be auditors, because when we think about integrated assurance, it's about the audit together with the assurance on sustainability information. So it's going to be a firm of professional accountants. And for them, they will use Part 4A, because that is the baseline for audits. Anything that applies for audits ought to apply for sustainability assurance, with perhaps one or two additional provisions to fill in the gaps if there are very specific issues pertaining to sustainability assurance. But essentially, it is the book as we have it. It is a green book. It is the IIS that sit in Part 4A. Otherwise, for any provider, any assurance provider that will perform a sustainability assurance engagement, and they are not going to be doing the audit, they will essentially need to use a new set of standards. Now, we're not talking about where those standards are going to sit, but they will have to run with a new set of standards focused specifically on sustainability. So that is our starting point. Now, I guess it's important for us all to understand the design and architecture of the code, and in particular, the international independent standards that sit in Part 4A. The IIS essentially leverage the building blocks approach, as we call it, of the code. In other words, it's built on the foundation that is in Part 1, which is the conceptual framework, which comprises the conceptual framework plus the fundamental principles. And there are also parts 2 and 3 that address sustainability, that will address the assurance engagements and the roles and the responsibilities of individual providers relative to the ethics requirements. Now, with respect to the options that are presented, there is a bit of a conundrum because the options are, if I can perhaps picture it a bit, it's a bit of a bifurcated approach in the sense that only the Part 4A requirements would apply to the non-PAs because they're brought into Part 4A as practitioners. There are no requirements that would apply to them that sit in Parts 1 to 3. And the options that are presented essentially come with an external guide, a set of guidance material as to how they should interpret Parts 1 to 3. Now, for accountants, clearly they will have to apply Parts 1, 2, and 3 anyway. So essentially, it is about the non-PAs and how they would go about complying with and following the building blocks approach and how they would apply the conceptual framework. Essentially, we have this guide. Now, there are, I guess two immediate practical challenges that come to mind. One is the issue of enforceability. And that kind of is a stark challenge because now the non-PAs are not in Parts 1, 2, and 3. They are sitting outside the code. They only have the requirements in Part 4A. And there is a guidance document that will help them interpret the requirements. The second issue is about adoption by jurisdictions. And guidance by nudge doesn't have the same level of authority as standards, even with an IESBA badge on it. And that's a bit of a challenge for the board as to how jurisdictions would adopt essentially what we would call profession agnostic standards, when part of it sits in Part 4A, but the rest actually isn't there, but it's a guidance document as to how to apply the rest of the code. Now, one could argue that we could work around this by extending Parts 1, 2, and 3 to apply to non-PAs, so that in effect, they become subject to the same requirements as PAs. Now, the guidance piece can still coexist, because no matter what pathway the board chooses, we can expect that the non-PAs will need support and assistance, and non-authoritative material would come in very handy. But therein lies a predicament for the board, which perhaps the working group has already considered. And that is that with non-PAs now fully within the scope of the code in Parts 1, 2, and 3, if we were to really bring them fully within the scope of the standards, the board would effectively be setting ethics standards for all professionals, PAs and non-PAs, who perform similar work or activities as PAs, not just sustainability assurance engagements. Now, that might be the ultimate vision for the board, but it would be a much longer road to travel if the board were to decide to go down that path in the public interest. But the focus right now, the strategic focus for the board is on ethics and independent standards that would support sustainability assurance. So how could one resolve this conundrum, if I can put it that way? Well, there is a fifth option that we have discussed both in the planning committee and at the board. We've touched on it in September, and that is a standalone set of standards tailored to sustainability assurance engagements that would apply neutrally to both PAs and non-PAs. Now, this is in fact the model IESBA is pursuing. It is a standalone overarching standard focused on sustainability assurance engagements, not one that entails revising its existing general assurance standards, ISA 3000, to cover sustainability assurance. Now, I have noted the working group's thoughts that perhaps this approach would create some difficulties for jurisdictions to adopt a standalone set of standards because it would not be anchored to the code. My reaction, I suppose, is that this isn't true because in order to achieve a level playing field, any sustainability assurance standards would need to be grounded in the conceptual foundation of the code, whether those standards sit within or outside the code. And jurisdictions now are building the necessary standards infrastructure to support sustainability reporting and assurance. They will use whatever legal or regulatory instrument they consider appropriate to adopt not only the reporting and assurance standards that are being developed by IESBA and IESBA, but also the ethics and independence standards that this board will develop. So in fact, this is already the case with the extant code. Jurisdictions take a variety of approaches relative to adoption of the extant code. So ultimately, it is for the board to assess objectively whether a package that consists of the international independent standards with scope extended cover non-PAs, plus an accompanying guide that cannot, but indeed must not be separated from the code as revised to apply to PAs, would altogether constitute professional agnostic standards. That is really what the board has to consider in the context of everything that we will hear and in the context of what I've painted. So regardless of the path we're taken, I fully agree that the board will need to test out the particular path we're taken with stakeholders, especially the non-PAs, be flexible and be open to hearing the feedback. Thank you, Gabriela.
Thank you very much, Ken. What I can see, and picking up on what Mark said in his last sentence, that what I think that we have some consensus here. I'm not going to address the technical part, and I'm going to be very quick. And I just want to elaborate a little bit on Mark's presentation and information, and also a little bit on what Ken said. Just to make sure that the board reflects on these proposals with full information and full consideration also from my side. Mark, I think that we have some consensus already and that we are making progress. And that if we think about the discussion in Nashville and what is being said today, I think that we already have some consensus about where we want to land. And it's clear that there was some progress made since Nashville. And it's very clear today, in fact, in front of the facts that there is no question anymore about whether we should or should not, because we must develop these profession agnostic standards. Mark, I think that this is what you also convey to the board. The call from the international regulators is very clear. They are already in the market. And by the way, they account for an impressive number of providers. Considering what the research made by IFAC on how much these providers already are, I mean, how many they are, it seems that they are more or less worldwide, like 50% of the providers, sustainability assurance providers are independent providers. It's a higher number in the United States, seems much higher. But generally, I think we can agree, or we can understand that they are more or less half of the market already. What we also know today, from the outreach that me, Ken, but also Mark has been undertaking, is that they exist, they are there, they are already doing the job, and they are organized. They have associations, they have a voice. They are sitting together with the regulators and policymakers. They are at the table discussing and negotiating in Europe, in France, in Australia, etc. They are part of the decision process, so we can't ignore them. But before that, let me just put you in front of something that I think it's critical for us to assess and address and analyze all these, and it's what does success look like? What does it mean for us as a board, dreaming or wanting to land in a place which means success for us? And I think that there are no doubts that we all agreed, and Mark was very clear about that. We want to develop something which is high quality standards that can be recognized, accepted, adopted, and implemented in the wider possible way. This is what we want. We all want, and I think there are no doubts about it. So what we have to do is to see as we go, what's the best way, the best pathway to go there, to make sure that we develop something that is accepted in a wide, within a wide circle of providers. And of course, we can't ignore that international regulators will have a word to say there, because it's on them to decide which standards are going to be applied by whom. I also, so this is what success looks like. It's at the end of this project, we will deliver a product that through its the recognition of the standards may be part of the future infrastructure of standards formed by IESBA, IESBA, and IESBA. And I, as chair of IESBA, I can't accept other result. I want IESBA to be part of this infrastructure. I want the IESBA standards to be there, not because we want to be famous, but because we really think, and I think that we all agree, that these ethics standards are critical, crucial in the future infrastructure. So some facts and some information that we will have to have in our mind when reflecting about this proposal and the technical coverage that Mark has asked you to give to the technical work that is being developed. We also agree, and I think that's the same for all of us, that we have to remain agile. I mentioned that, Mark was very clear about that. There is a lot of things that, there are a lot of things changing as we go, and so that agility is fundamental, but I'm not going to repeat that. But in front of these facts, the IOSCO statement and call for professional agnostic, the letter from New Zealand and Australia, but also some information that we got in this outreach. These are all facts that we have to take into consideration. Now, about risks, and we have to see them. And the slide, I think it was, slide 7 from Mark. Mark says, what can the board see any unintended consequences of developing something separated? Of course, we have to assess and address those unintended consequences on both ways. If we were to develop something separated, which consequences, and Mark, can also elaborate a little bit on that. But if we do something different, what can be the consequences that we are not seeing? And it's those risks that we have to bring into our consideration and reflections. And again, I'm concerned. It's not that I'm concerned, but what I think the board should consider and have in mind when moving forward with this project is that at the end, our standards will be subject to some decisions to be adopted or not to be adopted by a larger number of providers or a shorter number of providers. There are local decisions from local jurisdictions, but there are also the decisions from international regulators, which inevitably will define the wideness of application of our standards. And of course, what we should aim at was to have the same recognition, the same acceptance, the same adoption as the IESBA standards and the IEESB standards. So we have to make sure that through this outreach that Mark so well and so on which Mark was so insistent, to gather information mainly from those external providers, also mentioned by Christelle, we are now sure that they will be part of the decision. They will be sitting at the table, negotiating, lobbying, etc. We know that the final decision that will be made by decision makers, policy makers, regulators, etc., will not accept something that will not be acceptable by a wide number of providers. we know that we want all those providers to have the same ethical bar and not different ethical bars and different standards. And that's all that we have to do is that we work for that purpose and we work for that final result, which is to have our standards recognized, really profession agnostic, that are seen as profession agnostic and that are accepted by the highest number of providers, not to take the risk of having the IESBA standards applying to professional accountants and something different applying to other professions, which would be a very negative outcome in terms of public interest. What the public interest calls us to do is to develop something of high bar, high quality standards that can be applicable to all. But I'll stop here and yes, and open the door for comments and considerations, unless Mark wants to add anything before we open.
Thanks, Gabriella. I just think, really to emphasize the importance that these positions are changing in ways that we might not have appreciated. So, for instance, if you go back 3 or 4 months, it seemed likely that the European Commission's CSRD proposals would have excluded auditors and professional accountants from providing assurance in respect of sustainability engagements. The proposal that now appears to be going to the Parliament is that the EU will require equivalence for ethics and independence, similar to that applies in an audit. So, of course, the ethics and independence requirements that we currently have in the code will apply in full to sustainability auditors in the EU. And that's a position that's changed very quickly. And I believe that those positions will continue to change. We're waiting to see whether the Securities and Exchange Commission will finalise its rule changes. That will also create an equivalent playing field where sustainability providers are following similar ethical and independence requirements as will apply to PAs. So that's why we need to continue with the work in hand and inform our discussions through greater stakeholder outreach, but remain ready to move to do something which, as you say, Gabriella, is also important, that it's an enforceable route for people wishing to take action.
Thanks, Mark. I'll MC the session. So I encourage the board members to share any comments you might have in terms of the working group's 4 options, taking into account the PC's input and also the information we've received today from Ken and Gabriella, but also from the working group and from everyone, the need to continue to be agile and monitor the developments and outreach as well. Luigi, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Mark, for your presentation. And I agree with your proposed approach. It seems to me that so far it is what we need to implement in order to respond to this matter. I think that the working group should start dealing with the technical part, as you call it, or with the content one, I would call it, and defer any strategic decision when we have more visibility in terms of expectation from the stakeholders and impacts of each option we could select. I would call it the structure part, probably, the form of these new rules. Accordingly, I expect the working group to propose a roadmap focusing most on content at present, and to be alert and therefore to propose activities to tackle the structure matter, or let's say the strategic decision, as you call it, when necessary. I know that in your document you explain the type of outreach activities, roundtables, additional work you are proposing in order to be prepared to take this decision and to inform the board in order to also consider this important, very important piece of work. So far, I think that I agree with you, we need to be flexible and ready to take this strategic decision once we understand from the stakeholders what they expect and how they envisage that these new rules could be implemented in jurisdictions for PAs, but also for non-PAs. At the end of the story, the board is in a position to prepare the rules, to elaborate these rules, but at the end, there is a need for some of the stakeholders to take action in order to enforce these rules into jurisdictions. And therefore, the final form of these rules should really rely on their expectation and these impacts. So I think that it is premature so far for the board to take a definitive decision, but I expect that the working group action plan also include the way forward to arrive at this decision. I think also that in terms of content or technical matters, the roadmap, the action plan to be presented to the board in December should clearly identify the most critical decision to be taken. For example, whether or not we need to refine the PIE definition, whether or not we would like to retain the dual layer approach to independence, whether this dual layer approach would be entity specific, PIEs versus non-PIEs, or engagement specific, depending on the type of assurance engagement, or a mix of them, I don't know. I expect, therefore, the working group to set the direction for the board to consider. In terms of option in the short term, before taking a final decision on the structure and form of the rules, I think that the first three options, sorry for summarizing too much, the first three options are pretty similar or comparable, at least, while the fourth one is a bit different. And I think that in the short term, we could work with all of them, basically. I do prefer the third one, which seems to me, sorry for saying a thing that you probably do not agree with. It is probably the easiest one, or at least, let's say, the one that could bring us, let's say, the final scenario in a more fast way, probably. But of course, keeping in mind that at the end of this route, we could find ourselves in a situation where we should take another decision and then be in a situation to revert what we have agreed in a new form. But frankly, I'm open to all the structure and form of strategic decision, but I would like to take the final decision once I understand what the stakeholders would like us to do.
For my part, Luigi, that's extremely helpful. And I should share with you, as I shared with the planning committee, when I was in Korea earlier last month, Tom Siedenstein from the IESBA has a great line where he says, we shouldn't let perfect get in the way of good. And we have to recognize that we are working to a very aggressive timetable. And I share your view that sometimes we should look for things that give us room for maneuver and maybe slightly easier to digest, because that allows us the opportunity to meet this very ambitious timetable.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Luigi. Any other board members comment, or perhaps if you have any questions for Mark as well, if you need him to clarify any points, please raise hands. Sadia, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And for the opening comments. You've said a lot of things that were not in the paper that I agree with, especially the part on flexibility. I think that it's important for us to be flexible. I thought I'll go after Luigi because some of my comments are actually aligned with what Luigi mentioned, and that is, currently, the pros and cons don't leave us with a clear answer of which is the compelling reason in the public interest. So that voting on one of those at the moment is not, I felt it difficult to pinpoint. And that is because, as you mentioned, some of those instrumental or the big items haven't yet been discussed. And where we land on that might channel which option is the best one. So the definition of public interest entity, how we land on those network firms, and then also the definition of engagement team, which is still to be finalized. Luigi went with the option of 3, and I was actually thinking the option of 4, but I'm mindful that they are the same thing because depending on what comes out, you might be saying, actually it creates too much complexity in 4A and we might need to take it out. And that is, we might learn new things from our stakeholder interaction that may be applicable just to sustainability assurance engagements. But as we try to explain it, we're going to have to explain why this doesn't apply to audit and review engagements. And having said all those things, I think that we should agree on delving into the technical elements and leave the decision on where it fits to a later decision. Thank you.
I think that's again very helpful, Sadia. And I think that if we sat down and we wrote the text that we think we could write now, I guarantee you by September next year it would be out of date because things would have moved at such a rate. And I also think one of the challenges for us, and I'm sure it's the same for you, when you come from a regulatory background, you have to sort of bear in mind that bit of your brain that says, what would work in my jurisdiction, but then think that informs my decision, but it doesn't drive it because, as you say, what delivers the best outcome in the public interest? So I absolutely agree, flexibility, but let's build our approach.
Thanks, Sadia and Mark. Sanjeev?
Thanks, Ken. First of all, thanks, Mark, for the excellent presentation. And just, I think, adding on to what Luigi and Sadia said, I think it is premature to, vote, and you're not asking us to vote right now to, talk about the options because a lot is changing and a lot is changing on a regular basis. Sadia also said very nicely that we need to keep it simple, and I think you also mentioned it, that we may have to go for good and not perfect. So my recommendation is also that the working group should continue with the technical substance of the matter so that one is then prepared to decide which way to move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjeev. We might take a few more comments first, Mark, if that's okay. Brian?
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Mark and team. First of all, I want to recognize the significant amount of work that went in here, in particular in putting together the samples, which I thought were really helpful in bringing the different options to life. So I agree with the separation to the extent possible of strategic decision-making versus the technical drafting, but I would nonetheless caution that how we start the technical drafting does impact strategy as it frames our direction for the world, and it potentially changes the nature of some of the discussions that we have with stakeholders, both with traditional stakeholders, but I think even more so with those stakeholders outside of our normal group of folks that we have outreach with, like engineering and consulting firms, whom we expect to follow these standards to ensure a level playing field for everyone performing these activities. I really do agree with what everyone said at this point, which is flexibility is key in this dynamic landscape. And it struck me, I very much agreed with Laurie's use of the word complex here rather than complicated. We're going to need to make decisions, obviously, to move forward, but we have to be prepared to iterate and pivot probably quite considerably, Mark, as you just said, as we move along. So staying flexible is important. Obviously, we need to meet with non-PAs who are already performing this kind of work, as Gabriella said, and others have acknowledged as well, particularly engineering firms and different specialty consulting firms who at this moment are operating in this space. So they are already following certain standards and have come up with their own internal guidance, often referring to external guidance or standards in terms of how they proceed along their path. So having said all that, and I know we're not voting at the moment, but I think for me, starting along option 4 provides the clearest pathway for non-PAs to start to think about these standards. And it seems to me to yield the most flexibility to considering option 5, so which I'm calling option 5, the separate code. And I'm wondering whether option 5 has been considered. This is just another throwaway takeaway or consideration, but whether option 5 might apply to only non-PAs performing sustainability work and keeping the code intact for PAs performing this kind of work, just as an option. I know that's a different split than what the planning committee was talking about. I'm also wondering about other forms of assurance that are up and coming, like some emerging requirements for AI and machine learning types of insurance being asked for. And as some of those systems become more integral into organizational systems, I'm again sort of thinking about option 4 and the additional flexibility that that could provide, and option 5 as well. And it seems to me that for me at this point, heading down an option 4 track leads us to the potential for keeping option 5 on the table with a decision in the short term in terms of whether we do that or not. My headspace is I really like option 5, but I think we need to explore that a little bit more. And option 4, get going on the drafting, makes sense in any event, because we do need to get on with that, particularly given the timeline. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. Andy.
Okay, there you go. Thank you. Yeah, I'd, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mark, and the working group, because this is really cool stuff. I mean, I do want to first, reiterate again that 100% support prioritized projects to revise the code's ethical and independent standards to address, in the public interest, the highly critical needs for ESG information. I mean, I think I'm on the record for that going back to last December. And of course, as I mentioned, our piece in the entire mantle of producing information and providing assurance on it is one piece, because there are other reporting and information standards that are developed by others. And I found extremely helpful your, what I'll call the technical now, strategic later approach. So I am responding favorably to that as something we could work on. And I do also responded well to the need to perform extensive outreach to see how and to what extent the regulatory community and others who are responsible for adopting or enforcing provisions for professionals would be followed. And I think this is something also that Luigi mentioned as to what, if we build it, the field of dreams is if we build it, they will come. So if we write it, will they use it? But first, I think we do have to write it. And I can understand that the world finally, at long last, seems to be recognizing the value of ESG. And I guess I'm including the S and G as well, but I realize environmental is taking the lead. And assurance on it is a priority project. And it seems prudent and in particularly efficient for the world's regulatory community to look at what's available and adopt those standards that are high quality, applicable for all practitioners, not just necessarily PAs. And thus it doesn't surprise me that the IESBA code would stand out to the world as an existing, thoughtful, and publicly interest-oriented code for this purpose. But the ultimate end game, which I guess I'm finally getting to, of having two sets of standards perhaps might be awkward to maintain and revise. And of course, I think we've all addressed, we don't want to have unintended consequences that the high quality ethical and independent standards that are used to provide assurance on financial information would somehow be upset or discombobulated by the various jurisdictions that use our code. And we're not going to do that. Whatever we do, we'll expose, we'll ask our stakeholders for their input, and I think we would take very seriously any direction that looks like it would upset that extremely critical part of where PAs fit into the mantle of independence and capital reporting. Just a couple more notes I have here that I raised in September that this could be perhaps, I don't know if this is the fair way of putting it, Mark, but a publishing exercise, or an exercise where if we continue apace at revising our code, that I'm imagining a cross-reference table, an extraction, a taxonomy, if you will, that then would be some appendix in a document that could be used to just extract the parts of the code that are applicable to all professions, that then could be placed in this publication, again with a cross-reference to our code, such that once we, because the maintaining two separate codes could be extremely awkward, because you revise one, you have to revise the other, and then when you have two, they tend to drift apart, just the natural order of things. But to take the one code and then to essentially just publish it with a cross-reference table, that it would be applicable for sustainability, for ESG only. Now, so an extraction, a taxonomy, or cross-reference for that purpose, I think I'd respond favorably to that. I've also asked, I think in September, that we be provided with examples of how and to what extent our existing standards are being used by other professions and enforced around the world, because I know that there are parts that imply, or at least state, that they can be. And so I'd be interested if there are any lessons to be learned there. So ultimately, I think I'm between the different options. I'm less concerned with the technical now, strategic later approach. I think there's a part of option one I'm responding to well, because it doesn't change the definition of audit. And one of my must-dos rather, I'm not sure where my mouth is working at this hour, but is the not doing anything to upset the PA's role in preparing and providing assurance to the capital markets and stakeholders on financial information. And so I'm initially responding well to that, but I think I'd be open to the other various iterations of that as well, as you consider what to present to us for next month. But anyway, that's my overarching view, Mark. I'm certainly put me down as a big supporter of increasing in the public interest, the ethical and independent standards, that I wouldn't want some other profession to not be independent of the entity for which they're providing assurance, because that's not in the public interest. And gosh, we've developed independent standards that are already there. So I think it is efficient for the world to turn to those. But I do share the concerns mentioned about how and to what extent it will be enforced, and we should work in parallel. And it sounds like we are with those different groups to say, if we build it this way, will you put it in there? And again, recognizing that this doesn't change auditing standards, this doesn't change our code that you're asking us to work on. Won't change the auditing standards, won't change the accounting standards, or part of this is how does one figure out what carbon emissions are, or scope 1, 2, and 3 items. That's maybe not for us to come up with, but nevertheless, the people who are providing assurance on that ought to be independent of the entities in the same fashion, and that the fundamental principles of role and mindset, et cetera, ought to be transportable and in the public interest used by those entities. So thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Mark, we might just take one more comment from Sunam and we'll ask you to respond. Sunam, please, your turn.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, and also working groups for tremendous work done. I agree with you, the approach working group has put together as Mark presented. In particular, I couldn't agree with you, Mark, more in connection with the importance of the continued importance of continued outreach with stakeholders, including non-PAs. In connection with options 1, 2, 3, 4, I believe understandability is the most important factor we need to take into account in making a decision, because the part 4A of the extant code is the area even seasoned PAs in practice have experienced difficulties in understanding and applying independence provisions. The difficulty was highlighted in September when we discussed group audit setting, engagement team, and audit team. All of us were very difficult time and confused sometimes. So given that I believe understandability is the most important factor, the non-PAs will have the same experience, I believe, with if we put together the pieces relating to audit and assurance, sustainability assurance engagement together. So given that if we do not take option 5, I support option 4 in consideration of first one is it is much easier and clearer, both PAs and non-PAs, to understand, because all the elements of sustainability engagement will be put together in one single area. Second, it will be easier to revise the code in the future in connection with any issues specific to either audit engagement or non-audit sustainability engagement. Lastly, we can get our code better aligned with IESB's standard structure. Given that IESB has decided to develop a separate standard, IESSA 5000, instead of revising or leveraging the current standards such as ISAE 3000 and 3410. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunam. Mark, will pass it to you.
Thank you, and it's really helpful to have this feedback and insight from the board, and I note the refrain from a number of members about the importance of doing what we can to maintain flexibility. I think you raise a really interesting question, Brian. I sort of worry about the road to hell is paved with good intentions. What we need to do is answer two questions that are really hard to answer. What do we need to do to maximize the global endorsement of the work that we develop? And at the same time, what do we need to do to ensure that jurisdictions can then adopt it? And the thing that worries me, and I'm sure other board members will have the consideration, is not ending up in a situation where we have one but not the other. We need to try and find a way that accommodates both. And I certainly am very alive to that. The point you make, Andy, is a fair one indeed. How can you reference the material to make it more accessible? There has to be a technological answer to it. There certainly is with the tagging of financial information, and we're seeing that expand into non-financial information. So it should do that. And I do sympathise with the view of a second set or a second iteration means more work, means more updating. And I think that is really important. And I also think it's really important in avoiding any sort of regulatory arbitrage between versions and how they work. I think the point that Sung Nam makes about understandability. Quite often I get told by my stakeholders in the UK that there's a gulf between those who set standards and those who use them. We've got to make sure that for people wanting to comply with their obligations, it's simple and straightforward for them to do so. So therefore we can't overcomplicate the approach to that. But I think, really, really helpful insight. And the point, of course, is constantly re-emphasized about the need for further outreach and really to get further perspectives. And I think possibly at the end of this meeting, one thing that I may ask of all board members is perhaps for your thoughts as to the challenge of what adoption or endorsement would mean in your own jurisdiction, so we can understand all the potential routes to taking the new standards and having them more widely used. So if I hand back to you, Jeff, and we'll take some more questions.
Thank you, Mark. We have quite a few more. So Chana, please.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Mark and the team for your presentation, and quite a lot of work done during the last month and a half. Just a bit of background, if I may, on the Australia and New Zealand letter. Subsequent to the Nashville board meeting, a week later was the Australian board meeting, and we have sustainability and technology as two standing items, and so an update was provided on sustainability, and the Australian board had a debate about whether Part 4A was the best, and then came to the conclusion, like Sunam just said, people find 4A really difficult, and it was option of, do we say something now, or do we wait till a ED comes out and then criticize the approach? And the board decided, on balance, it's better to say something now rather than keep quiet. And then when we checked with our New Zealand colleagues, they decided to join us as well. And New Zealand is far more advanced because they had to come up with a standard by December or ED, where they're doing ED where they have to provide on greenhouse gas emissions, and it's going to be a very simple one, but it incorporates the auditing, the quality management, and the ethics, everything in one, and it will have a finite life, because they are all waiting for the international standards to be in place, but the government has given the IESBA the mandate to do this, but on the proviso that it's open to all, not just accountants. And the main provider in New Zealand, because we have to understand that some of these providers, the non-accountants, have been operating for decades. And the main provider in New Zealand, it's not an accounting group. And they use the ISO standards. And so the IESBA is faced with developing something that needs to satisfy that group as well. So I think that's a challenge we have. We are coming into a space where there is already established players and who have been operating for a long time. And New Zealand has also, one of the things, Mark, is the stakeholder engagement is really important, because they have, through the stakeholder engagement, they have found that they're using different terminology. So if you say NAS, they don't know what that is. But if you say consulting services, they know what that is. So it's like even the terminology needs to be sort of catered so that we have broader acceptance of it. And the other thing I have sort of noticed is even in Australia, in the sustainability forums, that the sustainability assurance is provided by, even if it's the same firm, by a different team. And they are not necessarily financial statement auditors. So the people who may ultimately need to use this might be not really the financial statement audit team, but a different team. So, the options would be, it could be the same firm, a different team within the same firm, or it could be another accounting firm, or it's a sustainability firm providing the service, which is not aligned with the accounting firm. So those are sort of the three parties. And when I look at them, I sort of lean towards option 4. And I think even Mark, you could run in the interim with option 3 and 4, because 3, you're not doing much change, and you could sort of see that it's aligned, and keep progressing on 4. So you could, I think, in the short term, work with both 3 and 4. That's sort of, I sort of prefer 3 to 1, just because it seems to just convoluted a lot with a lot of the additions. So I like the simpler one of 3. I know Tandy is looking at me because it might be issue for audit, but I mean, if we can come up with a neat way, I think 3 is a good check, just to see that you're keeping it aligned. And with the comment about keeping the different parts aligned, I mean, part 4B has been kept aligned with 4A for a long time now, probably over a decade. So it's just another challenge to keep another section aligned. So those are my comments. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Chana. If I can just ask the remaining board members and participants to keep your comments brief and succinct. We do have quite a few more who've got raised hands, and also we have a couple of items we want to speak to the board at the end, and we want to finish on time as well. So with that, Panya, please.
Yes, thank you, Jeff. And just to complement to the flexibility aspect, I would use the understandability of Sunan as communication. I think that the final result of our work to be accepted by regulation and by preparers and the market in general, it depend on how well we are able to communicate our purpose and the result. If it is technically perfect, but it is not well understood by the market, it would not be acceptable. And that communication effort should begin to right now among us, and also in the outreach, so people that we are consulting really understand what we are proposing. And by the end of the job, we must to be able to communicate the result for regulators and the market in general.
Thank you, Vanya. Yao Shu?
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Mark. And I agree that this is a very important priority project. And but I think when we revise the code, we should keep in mind that our code is the most important user is for the PAs. That's I think we should keep in mind, because that's the important, very important, because our code is used most important by the PAs. So I don't agree that puts the audit and the sustainability in the same status in the code, because I think the maybe that's the stakeholders they think that's the independence requirements for the audit and the sustainability activities should be the same. But I don't think that in our code we should put them in the same together, in the same status. And I prefer that option 4 and put in a separate part to give this sustainability requirements. And I think for the user friendly, I don't think we put audit and sustainability in the same term is a good option. Thank you.
Thank you, Yaoshu. Hero, please. Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Mark, and the working group for your huge effort and thorough consideration. Surely we need more information to make a final decision, but I think that user friendliness is a key consideration, especially for non-PA assurance providers. Also, given the uncertainties we are facing, including the IESBA standards, IWSB standards, the future developments of assurance practice, and other factors, I totally agree that it's important to be as flexible as possible. And as for the proposed 4 options, in my view, at this moment, in terms of user friendliness and flexibility, separate 4A or even separate handbook would be preferable. So my preference is option 4. Thank you.
Thank you, Hero. Caroline?
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Mark, and the working group for the extensive work that was done in order to come up with the 4 options and the thinking behind it all. You know, hearing comments about easy to use, about flexibility, to me, making changes to part 4A, whether it's to insert sustainability assurance engagements, sustainability assurance providers throughout part 4A, or whether to change the definition to say that any reference to audit engagements or audits of financial statements also includes sustainability assurance engagements, I think does not get us to where we want to go, especially if we have to pivot at short notice. And so I think we ought to really take a leaf of what IEESB has done. And so IEESB has ISAEs, which they are keeping, and they've got the ISSAs, the International Standards on Sustainability Assurance. And this allows them to be flexible, pivot, and respond to changes. And I think we need to, on the ethics side, think of the same. So just as we have the code for Part 4A, which is for audits and reviews of financial statements, we then have Part 4B, which is for other assurance. And you know, whether we call it 4A star, 4C, or essentially having it as a standalone part of the code, I think allows us and gives us that flexibility, that ease of use. One other point I want to make is that currently there are a lot of service providers that are not PAs providing assurance on sustainability. But if we see the direction and the end game being integrated reporting, then if I think of what Gabriella has said, you know, what would success look like? Where do we want to be at the end of the day? We would want the code to be setting the independence standards, and we would want auditors to be carrying out assurance not just on financial statements, but also on sustainability information, whether it's financial or non-financial information. So I think that there is a need to, if we've got part 4A, and that applies to auditors, then if we get to integrated reporting, as Ken said earlier on, 4A serves our purpose. We might need to supplement that. As we get to that scenario, in the meantime, we do have other players in the market. And so those other players are not going to be keen to be looking at our code. And so it would make sense, in order to encourage them to adopt the sustainability part of what we are developing, to have it as standalone. But that standalone essentially also includes how they would apply the other parts of the code, the ethics and the principles part of it. So to me, 4A, for option 4, it's a starting point, but it's not the end game. And one other concern I have is that if we make too much changes to part 4A, that it could impact independence as it applies to audits and reviews of financial statements, because you don't know what the consequences are that might arise as a result of these changes. And my last comment, sorry for taking so long, but my last comment is that I think Andy mentioned that our code is an international code, and it's widely recognized, but our code is a code for professional accountants. And in the world out there, there's the International Organization for Standardization, which you would know as ISO, and they have developed standards that are widely used and well recognized, and those standards include sustainability standards as well. So what is stopping them from developing a standard on ethics? They do have a standard on quality management as well. So I think we need to recognize that we are not the only international ethics standard setting body. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Felicia.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Mark, for, again, like my colleagues have mentioned, for good work done. I'll not dwell again back to the discussions, but I just also want to make an emphasis on a few issues, especially if you talk about amending the part 4A. Yes, that could be an option that possibly would yield a good result. And if you look at the other options, option 1 up to 3, probably I wouldn't go for those for reasons that have just been mentioned by other members. My preference would be maybe going for option 5, which would be probably coming up with a different set of handbook that would include, of course, sustainability assurance in detail, so that it removes confusion by non-PAs. I would imagine if someone was to get a handbook and he's a non-PA, so that person would probably struggle to even navigate because even PAs struggle to understand the entire code. So I think it would make a lot of sense for having a separate handbook that would address all other issues regarding sustainability. The other issue is, if you think about other standards, like Brian mentioned, you're talking about AI and many others that would come up. And when I look at the top of the code, it says, of course, the International Ethics Board for Accountants Code, which includes independence and sustainability. So imagine other maybe the standards will come up. So how many changes would you have on the code going forward? So I believe that possibly option 4 would work, but maybe option 5, which would come up with a separate set of standards, would probably be better going forward. So we avoid confusion, it brings understandability of the code, and narrows down to specific aspects of sustainability. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Felician. Galen?
Thank you so much. And I'll try to make it brief because I know we're short on time, but a lot of the comments that I've heard so far have been focused on the providers as opposed to recipients. And I think we need to maybe flip it on its head and look at what is being received. And that's very clear that there's an expectation of the same level of independence and the same level of ethics. And therefore, in my way of thinking, and I'm looking through my lens, and that's as a regulator in my jurisdiction in the past anyway, I prefer one document because otherwise I believe that you're going to have some confusion. Now, the question is well, does that present a problem for non-PAs? And it may, but you know, this is a complicated area that they're dealing with anyway. These are smart people, and I think if users have an expectation of a high standard, then the non-PAs need to step up and be part of that. And I'm pretty sympathetic to what I just heard Carolyn say about a possibility of a Part 4C, and I do think preserving the integrity of the financial statement audits that is presented in 4A needs to be preserved, especially. And I think Andy pointed that out as well. I think that should be a priority. But my personal preference would be, though, one document, and I would be flexible, whether that be option 1 or option 3. But thank you very much for the opportunity to provide my input. Thank you.
Thanks, Galen. Just one more comment, Mark, and we'll pass it to you, and then we'll give an opportunity for our PLB observer to provide her feedback. Junpei?
Yes. Thank you, Jeff. Mark, thank you very much for your presentation and your hard work. I'd like to support your proposed outline. Also, I agree that flexibility is important as the reporting and assurance of sustainability is changing very rapidly. From the perspective of clarification of independence rules related to sustainability assurance and the future application of the code in each jurisdiction, option 4 would be the best for the public interest. I think it is ideal that non-PAs, but also not only PAs, but also non-PAs could use the code for sustainability assurance separately from audit. Also, there are several advantages as our members mentioned. However, currently, accelerated response is very important for the public interest. I think at this point, it is necessary that Part 4A should be revised to cover sustainability assurance in a timely manner. From this perspective, I believe that option 2 would be the second best, because the guidance for non-PAs can compensate for disadvantage of option 2. I believe that it is important for us to have a balance between high quality of the code and timelineliness. I would appreciate if the working group would give us an additional explanation about the feasibility from the point of resource and timeline. Although I understand that it is difficult to estimate future workload of this project. It is very complicated. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Junpei. I don't see any other hands, so up to you, Mark, to respond.
Thank you, Jeff. No, that again, it's all really helpful insight. I think the one thing that I'm really clear on now is that as we go forward, I'm probably going to disappoint all of you on the grounds it shows that what we're asking for are a number of different things to meet different needs. And therefore, we're going to have to accept as a board, we're not going to get all of what we want, but we're going to have to make the best decision in the public interest that allows us to revise the code. And I think Galen's intervention was particularly helpful there, that we should consider what users of this information need and what drives their interest when looking at how we revise the code and how we deal with this really quite challenging, challenging sort of situation. And, I absolutely take the point that we're going to have to do that in the context of decisions being taken that will not be the same. So the demands of the EU may well be different to the demands of the US, that may well be different to the demands of Australia and New Zealand. Our response, and supported by the engagement of all of you on the board today, is going to be to think about how to best reflect that and how to be flexible to ensure that as that position moves forward, we are, best placed to respond to it. I think the working group has done an exceptional job in responding to the challenges of really trying to accommodate an enormous number of different views. And we realise that we have to go out there and get still further views to ensure that what we are able to develop is responsive, meets the public interest, is going to be applicable, is going to be adoptable, is going to be endorsable. So we have some way to go. I take the steer from the board about preferred options and about the way we can develop technical text, as well as engaging with our stakeholders to inform the strategic decisions. But this has been extremely useful in informing us how to develop the project plan that we'll present to you at the board meeting at the end of November. So thank you very much for the input. And I would leave you with that question of, I'm really interested in what's your route to adoption or endorsement in your jurisdiction, because those route maps are going to be really helpful to us in ensuring that we are able to overcome potential problems before they become a problem. So thanks, Jeff. I'm happy to hand over.
Great, thank you, Mark. We're going to ask our PIOB observer, Toshiko, but do you have any remarks or comments you want to make at this point?
Thank you, board. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Chair. I think I want to go back to the words I used in Nashville, in that I continue to be encouraged by the board's differing views in terms of submissions and proposals before them. And more importantly, that demonstrates how the board applies its mind into the standard setting process. I think just a few points that I have noted out of our meetings with the PIOB regarding the same is that notwithstanding the options that we have seen and heard being presented today, I think I'm also encouraged that the different speakers that have come on board today have kept reiterating different aspects of what is contained in the PIF. Obviously, timeliness, consistency, relevance, and more importantly, readability, adoptability, and implementability. So from that perspective, I think I would say the principles of the PIF, I've noted today that they kept coming up, which means that keeps us in check into where we are going to land, which hopefully will be fit for purpose. I'm also encouraged by the fact that we kept going back to the issue of saying we need to go back and include the non-PAs to the table, because if this is going to be an all-inclusive and all-covering adoptability framework, it will need the voices of those that are going to use it. I think there's one question, and there's one perhaps clarity that I needed from the paper submissions, that as we do those outreach, perhaps it's important to keep including them at every session. And I think Mark has put the call out for help in that space from the different jurisdictions that we have in the board already. So I think if we keep maintaining that and having those different views as we continue, they will really help come up with something that will work for everybody at the end of the day, and more importantly, have the public confidence that we need in terms of the public interest. Madam Chair, let me stop there. Those were just a few comments that I have. And just to note that for the next meeting, I think you will be with Begona, but I've thoroughly enjoyed observing last meeting and this meeting. Thanks.
Thank you. Gabriella, do you have any closing comments?
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Chego. It was also a pleasure to have you with us in Nashville and today, and of course we will keep on being fully accountable to the PIOB and transparent with respect not only to what we are doing, but the mindset and the criteria behind what we are doing. And you are right, all these concepts coming from the PIF have been considered even with, when we don't mention them expressively. Well, I'm not going to take long. I know that the time is we are almost running out of time, and that there is a few other topics that we would like to address. But before that, let me first thank again Mark for the presentation and for all the explanations and comments that you were able to provide to the members as the comments were being delivered, and that was very good. I was more in listening mode because it's very important to me to understand the feeling, to take the pulse of this board and understand the different perspectives, the different opinions, and we still see some different opinions around the table, which is, I think, a very healthy thing, mostly when we have a very difficult, big challenge ahead. This is, I think, we all agree that this is a big challenge for IESBA, but this is also a big opportunity, and the train will not stop twice, so we will have to take this train and make it right. And this takes taking all the considerations on board and all the perspectives, and as you said, remaining agile. At the end of the day, what we want is to deliver something that meets the public interest, and the public interest here is undoubtedly that we have high quality standards applying to all the providers without any regulatory arbitrage, without lowering the bar or adapting to any other requirements. We just need everyone being able to provide the same high quality services to protect the investors and the markets and avoid any kind of greenwashing, fraud, etc. that may be here involved. So this is we are an agreement on that, and this is makes things much easier. This being said, the direction of the board is very important. I retain the idea of agility, and we will need it as we go. I also take this idea of understandability of what we do, and not only for the regulators to understand what we are doing, but also for the ones that are going to provide the service. It's important to preserve what we have for PAs, and I understand that idea, but also to provide something that the others can accept, so that we make sure that the final result is acceptable by others. So I think that we have quite a number of achievements here in terms of agreements and ideas that we upon which we can build in the future work. We will consider, as Mark said, further the direction given by the board, both from the technical perspective, but also some strategic direction that at the end was given here by our considerations. And we hope that this will translate into a very strong and quite consensual project plan to be presented and discussed to the board in December. And I don't know if anyone else wants to come and say something, add something. Of course, we will keep in contact. And in case, and this is my commitment, in case there is anything between now and December board, which deserves your attention and your input or whatever, we will keep in contact by any means that may be necessary or applicable in the meantime. Thank you very much to all of you for this discussion, with this very rich discussion and direction. And I think that we would move now to some topics on the next meeting and closing. But I'll give the floor to Ken for this topic.
Thank you very much. And yes, the public session is closed.